Okay, so welcome everybody tonight. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I know more people are going to be popping in as the minutes go by, but welcome everybody. My name is Karen Lawrence. I'm the Assistant Director of Case Western Reserve University's Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, and I'm really excited for this lecture tonight. That I know a lot of you know that today is the 100th anniversary of the ratification. I made sure to ratification right of the 19th Amendment, and so it's the perfect time to do this lecture, and then next week is the anniversary of its certification. And so I'm really glad we had Mike Barron and I, who works at the League of Women Voters, we worked so hard to put together this year-long lecture program to celebrate this day, and then COVID came along and blew up all of our plans. So I'm so glad that we've been able to sort of pick up where we had to leave off there for a little while. So this should be a great talk. Before I introduce our speaker, I did just want to go through a little bit of etiquette and Zoom in case you haven't been to one of our lectures before. So we're in a webinar format, which means that you can see Heather and myself until I mute myself and go away while she's speaking, but we cannot see or hear you. But it's a good way to sort of reduce bandwidth to make sure that the lecture doesn't get too disrupted by internet connections and that sort of thing. But even though we can't see you physically, that doesn't mean that we don't want your interaction and to hear from you. And there are a variety of different ways to do that. So I see a couple of you have already discovered the chat button at the bottom of the screen. That's one way to chat with each other and to ask your questions. And then there's also a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen as well that you can type your question in there if you prefer to. And one of the things that I actually really love about Zoom is that you don't have to wait until the end of the lecture to ask your question. And so if Heather says something that you're intrigued by, you can type it in and it'll be there primed and ready and waiting for her when her lecture is over. And then we might also try, we'll see, there's also the option to try to raise your hand. And we might try to do that a little bit. And I do also have the ability to allow people to talk if that's something that you're interested in. Maybe type that in the chat button, or we'll figure that out as we go along. Oh, I need to speak up. I apologize. I must not be speaking loudly enough. So I will introduce our speaker, and then you will not need to hear me anymore until the Q&A. So our speaker is Heather McKee Hurwitz, who's a lecturer in the Sociology department here at Case Western Reserve University, and is also one of the core research faculty members in the Women's and Gender Studies Interdisciplinary Program at Case Western Reserve University as well. She has her Ph.D. and Master's in Sociology from the University of California in Santa Barbara, and has really devoted her life to studying and participating in a variety of different social movements, not just here in the US, but the global South as well, focusing on global justice, feminist, and anti-war movements. And at Case, she teaches about gender, these social movements, globalization, culture, inequalities, and social media, using qualitative and these quantitative methods. And in fact, her book is going to be due out this year. It's not published yet, but you can pre-order it. And it's called Are We the 99%? The Occupy Movement, Feminism, and Intersectionality. Oh, and before I forget, because I do this, I'm sorry, that I also wanted to make sure that I mentioned that tonight's lecture is co-sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland and the Cleveland History Center. And it's just such a great privilege to work with them and to bring this lecture tonight. And so with that, I turn it over to Heather.
Thank you so much, Karen, for that warm introduction. And thank you to the sponsors of tonight's talk. I'll be making a few mentions to the League of Women Voters. Of course, they're an important group to emerge from the suffragist struggle. So I feel very honored to be here. I am going to share my screen. Give me just a moment to bring that up. Okay, great. So tonight I want to start by telling just the very, very brief story of why we're meeting today. Today is the ratification of the 19th Amendment with a vote from Harry Byrne, in the Tennessee state legislature, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment. And Byrne was on the fence. I don't know if you know, some of you out there probably know this story, but we also need to thank tonight Feb Byrne. Feb was Harry's mother, and Feb wrote Harry a note that he kept in his pocket during the voting. And it said something along the lines of, support the suffragists, do this for your mother. And I think implied women everywhere. And he voted to approve. And so we are here today. And tonight being a special night, I want you to raise a glass. Hopefully you can see mine. You can kind of see it going in and out here. Here we go. Wanted to start with a toast, to raise a glass to the suffragists, to all the women activists and men who have fought for women's rights over the last 100 years. And let's celebrate. So cheers. And you can see here in this image, suffragists celebrating 100 years ago. Throughout my talk tonight, I'm going to make several comparisons between the actions of women 100 years ago and throughout the last 100 years and to contemporary women. And I feel this is the best way to honor this moment and to take a little journey through women's activism over the last 100 years and kind of honor everything that's been sparked by the abolitionist movement, the suffrage movement, and all of the movements that have come afterwards. So here we see Alice Paul, key suffragist, raising a glass in front of the banner that signifies the victory of suffrage, each star representing one of the states that ratified the amendment, and a little picture of the flag flying above my house today. So I'm celebrating the suffrage movement along with you in many ways, and maybe you're flying the flag as well, wherever you happen to be. Today's talk, I'm going to make 3 arguments. So in the first part of the talk, I'm going to argue that there's been a continuous flow of women's and feminist movements over the last 100+ years. Arguments that there were major breaks, or we should only think about these major waves of women's activism, I am going to argue are not accurate. Second, I will make the argument that the fight for equality includes voting and many other actions beyond voting. I'll talk a little about political actions and take stock of women's political representation today, political action over the last 100 years, as well as women's social movement activism over the last 100 years. Of course, this will be just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much to talk about. We could never fit it in 1-hour lecture, thank goodness, but maybe this will pique your interest to learn more and spend the next years reading some of the books that I'll be mentioning, where I've found great knowledge and inspiration about women's activism. And third, I'll focus more squarely on some of my research, which is about contemporary feminist activism, the ways that it's diverse in its goals, its tactics, its strategies, its locations, perhaps has diversified way beyond voting, and focus on the Occupy movement and Black Lives Matter and some of the debates within these movements. So I'll start by talking about the sweep of women's and feminist movements over the last 100 years. So I want to start by first thinking about, so 1920 happens, the 19th Amendment passes, So exciting. What happened to the suffragists? Where did they go? Well, they didn't just stop their activism. Of course, there were other goals that they had. And many of you are here today with the League of Women Voters precisely because of some of these suffragists. So here we have an image of Carrie Chapman Catt. She's holding a bouquet presented to her as she arrived in New York on August 26, 1920 for a suffrage celebration. Of course, Catt would go on to found the League of Women Voters, which many of you are members of and you're here today. And this organization branched out beyond suffrage because they had already achieved that goal. And they sought to advocate voter education broadly, for changes to welfare, and they sought to have a voice in international concerns as well. So, but during the suffrage movement, there was actually a kind of a split. I won't get into all of this politics tonight. So the League of Women Voters and Chapman Catt's kind of side of the movement went one way. And then we also had on the split, Alice Paul, sort of seen here, we demand an amendment to the United States Constitution, enfranchising women. And Alice Paul and the National Women's Party, after the passage of the 19th Amendment, shifted their focus to the Equal Rights Amendment to guarantee women constitutional protection from discrimination. So the ERA was ratified by 35 states through the 1970s. So this was a fight that they were engaged in from the 1920s through the mid-1930s. From the mid-1930s through the 1970s, 35 states ratified it. But by the 1982 deadline, it was still 3 states short to become a constitutional amendment. And still today, the ERA has not passed. And I do know that some contemporary feminists are taking up this struggle. They've renewed this fight for the ERA, especially the National Organization for Women. So hopefully it will pass within the next 100 years, hopefully sooner than that. So we have some evidence of activism continuing from the 1920s, 1930s. What about after that? What about the 1940s? Well, scholars and activists, until this book by Lila Roop and Verda Taylor, saw the 1940s and 1950s and even into the beginning of the 1960s as an era when women's movements and women's activism was not really in the spotlight. It was a time when women's activism somewhat contracted. There were some reasons for this. A 1945 Gallup poll states that only 18% of Americans approved of a married woman's right to work if she had a husband who could support her. Not really the best environment to be doing women's activism. Also working against women, women's rights advocates did not have access to political power. They really hadn't built that up even since the 1920s. And the prevailing cultural idea post-World War II was to have a normal family life, the feminine mystique, prioritizing of the housewife, using all of her pink appliances. So what happened to women's activism during this time, as Roop and Taylor describe it as the doldrums? Well, women who were very committed suffragists, who were committed to women's activism, they hung on, they dug in. And it really wasn't a time of building new membership, as was kind of that peak moment of the suffrage movement. But there were a variety of ways that they hung on and continued to fight for the ERA and various other aspects of women's culture. The National Women's Party developed a headquarters in Belmont House in Washington, D.C. You could put this on your post-pandemic bucket list to go and visit it. President Barack Obama designated the house a national monument on April 12, 2016. And from this house, the women's movement, at least the aspect of the National Women's Party, was able to consolidate, hold on, try to lobby Congress. The Belmont house is located right on Capitol Hill, a few blocks from Congress. And they tried to preserve their resources. They tried to make it through the period of abeyance, which abeyance is this hostile environment when social movements kind of go a little bit underground. They try to hang on to each other. So the 1940s and 50s, perhaps not the most peak moment of women's activism, but we saw women fighting to survive and keep their organizations alive. And it was these abeyance structures and processes that in part led to an outpouring of activism in the later 1960s and 1970s women's movements. But of course, what else was happening during this time? Women were fighting for women's political participation and rights, many of them in the civil rights movement. So after the passage of the 19th Amendment, of course, it was not enough. The amendment had not enfranchised all of the women across the United States, and women of color remained unable to vote through 1965, and even today still have trouble voting, and there is still much voting discrimination. We're seeing this in the news right now, a real push by some political people to limit the right to vote. So the civil rights movement became an opportunity for mixed gender activism, for many women to join in and fight not only for women's rights and especially women of color's right to vote and political representation and participation, but for a range of other civil liberties, of course. The book that I turn to think about and hear from the women leaders of this time is How Long, the African-American Women in the Struggle for Civil Rights by Belinda Robnett. And one reason that we know little about this period is that women in the civil rights movement were not the really official leaders or primary leaders of this movement. The civil rights movement adopted the structure of the Black church, which was in large part led by Black men. Yet, in her book, Robnett traces the vital role that women played in organizing the grassroots and connecting local communities to the national civil rights movement. She calls these women leaders bridge leaders for their role communicating, connecting, doing outreach, doing grassroots activism. So many of the women who had been involved in other women's rights activities shifted into fighting for civil rights during this period. In large part, the 1960s and 1970s was a time of greater women's visibility in their activism, and Benita Roth writes about this time as 3 separate roads to feminism having been developed during this time. So one of those streams was through that the continuing legacy of white women's activism, the suffragist movement, some of those women who were holding on, working on the ERA, Black women who entered into feminism as a critique of the civil rights movement, where they weren't allowed to be leaders, really couldn't assume those leadership positions, and also wanted civil rights to cover so many more issues pertinent to them as women, and the Chicana women's movement. So in the Western United States, and Chicana also becoming very active in Chicana or Mexican Americans fight for civil rights. This was a third entry point for women to develop women's and feminist organizations. So the 1960s, 1970s, we have much more fervent activism, but also characterized by racial divisions, a problem that the contemporary women's movement continues to work on. So to sum up this part of the talk, this sweep of 100 years of women's activism, I bring you to an image of the Tennessee River. And I selected this, of course, because today, again, we're celebrating Tennessee, the 36th state to ratify. And you'll see that river, it bends. It's wider in some parts. You can imagine the river rushes faster in some places and maybe gurgles along in other parts of the river. And Alison Crossley, in her book, Finding Feminism, Millennial Activists and the Unfinished Gender Revolution, terms women's activism over time in the United States as a river. She equates women's activism as not a wave that's crashed and has just dissipated along the shoreline, but it's more accurate to understand this sweep of time, the various ways that women's activism have flowed along, or as she calls it, waveless feminism, that one feminist and women's activism has flowed continually into the next. And she came up with this idea, and I agree with her theorization of this past 100 years, from talking with millennial activists who, like myself, feel some connection with the suffragists, who feel some connection with those women in the 40s and 50s fighting in a hostile environment, to women in the 60s and 70s who are still around. Maybe some of you are them, who are out in the streets still participating in social movements. So now that we have sort of a little overview of the last 100 years, a lot of successes, a lot of challenges that women activists have been through, I want to speak for this next part about the fight for equality, voting and beyond, and provide some details about the variety of kinds of activism that women have participated in. I'm going to start with the political action. In taking stock of how the suffrage achievement and the 19th Amendment opened up women's participation in the political sphere, but also some ways that there are still fights to be fought for equality. So let's start with the 1924 presidential election. Oh, and I want to just back up to mention that most of the information that I will share with you in this section is drawn from this book, 100 Years of the 19th Amendment, and I encourage you to read it. They're fascinating chapters, really doing this process of connecting back and forth between 100 years ago and today. I wrote a chapter of the book, and about a dozen or more scholars also wrote chapters to really celebrate this day, and it's available now. So let's think first about the 1924 presidential election. This was actually the second presidential election in which women were allowed to vote, and there was great hope, there was great promise for suffragists at this time. Would they sway the vote for president? Would they make a substantial contribution? How would they turn out? And the authors of this chapter draw on some fascinating data, and this is the story that they share. So back to the League of Women Voters. Thank you for educating and mobilizing so many women to vote in this election. The League of Women Voters played an important role in that. Yet only 38% of voters were women. And the authors explain this as there was not a habit of voting developed yet. This was a very new practice for so many women, and there remained a stigma against women's political activity. So women's rates of voting actually have not exceeded men's until the 1980s. It took a long time to really break through those barriers and for women to really accept and take up voting widely. So in 1924, the winner was Republican Calvin Coolidge. He was running on a pro-business ticket. He won 54% of the vote. The Democratic nominee was John W. Davis. He was kind of an unknown compromise candidate. He won 29% of the vote. And there was also a third party progressive nominee, kind of controversial, Robert La Follette. He was a Wisconsin senator. He was supported by reform groups, organized labor, farm organizations, socialists. We might have a lot of hope that feminists and suffragists would have voted for him widely and perhaps swayed the vote in his favor. Yet that did not happen. He only won 17% of the vote. And this study finds that there was actually no substantial vote for La Follette. Women supported the two major parties. So this was kind of our first indication of what would women do with their new suffrage powers. Well, they supported the two major parties. Here we have a picture of Mother Jones, a labor advocate, and she supported President Calvin Coolidge. Perhaps this is an indicator of why women voted for him in large degree. She said that he was fair and he was kind of a known quantity, and she saw that that would be important for the labor movement. Where have we gone since 1924 as far as women? Let's examine them actually in elected offices. So I want to share with you a graph here, the number of women in Congress over time, Republicans in the red, Democrats in the blue. We see the highest numbers, of course, in our current time period. And I think some of the participation of women in Congress kind of mirrors that story that I shared in the first part of this talk of women being involved kind of through the 1930s, but we see some dips in the 1940s, and then from the late 1970s onward, really a great escalation of women's participation in Congress. Since 2019, 23.7% of the 535 members of Congress are women. This is the highest percentage in history, something we should be proud of. I'm going to give another toast to the women in Congress today. This is twice the density as recently as 22 years ago. This is doubled. So let's hope that we can double it again, at least over the next 20 years. And I'll say that this graph is really important to me personally. I remember being 16 years old, and at that time, only 11% of our representatives were women. And I was shocked. It just seemed so unjust. How could women be so underrepresented in our government's leadership? And this puzzle has driven me to study gender and other forms of inequality since then, really. However, there are a lot of things that are not demonstrated in this graph. And one of them is the racial makeup of the women in Congress. Of the 127 women serving in the 116th US Congress today, 48, or 37.8%, are women of color. This amounts to 4 in the Senate and 44 in the House. In addition, a Black woman, a Latina, an Asian Pacific Islander, and a Caribbean American woman all serve as delegates to the House from Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, American Samoa, and the Virgin Islands, respectively. But these places still do not have full representation in Congress, as they are considered territories or non-states at this point. So these numbers show us a few of the horizons for women's political activism, increasing women of color's representation, and the enfranchisement, full enfranchisement and representation of women across some of these US territories. However, we should celebrate. In 2018, Democrats Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ayanna Pressley, Ilhan Omar, Deb Haaland, Veronica Escobar, and Sharice Davids were elected. These are some of the leading women of color in Congress today, and I think they deserve another toast. So cheers to them. They've all been making waves since they have entered Congress, and I think they provide a hope for where women's political activism within our government hopefully is headed. So as you can see, I've been providing this critical story about how far we've come in politics since suffragists opened that door for us 100 years ago. And I have to go back to 2016. I'm sure some of you out there are grumbling about this, but we have to remember our history and the great political divide between whites and people of color in our country in the unfortunate not election or loss of Hillary Clinton. Of course, she won the popular vote, however, did not win the Electoral College. And as you can see from this chart from a CNN exit poll, that racial divide within women's politics, within women's political action, showing up as a great number of majority of white women voting for President Trump, and a great majority of Black women and Latino women and others voting for Clinton. So I think it's good to look at these numbers and keep them in mind with our next election on the horizon, even the Democratic National Convention going on right now. And yet another horizon for women's activism today. Let's turn to social movement activism. So the suffragists not only opened up political avenues in voting and participation in politics, but also opened up a range of other social movement activism by their example, by many of their daring example and civil disobedience. So I want to mention three of these movements. The first is the abolitionist and civil rights movement. Of course, the abolitionist movement actually really fueled the suffrage movement, and there was a great connection between abolitionist movements and civil rights movements and suffragists movements. For Black women, especially Southern Black women, for Mexican Americans, Asians, Native American women, and many other women of color, we must recognize that today is a really measured celebration. The 19th Amendment was largely symbolic, and although it was a step in the right direction, it did not lead to any of these groups of women being able to vote. States controlled the polling stations and voting even for federal elections, and they allowed voter disenfranchisement of women and men of color. They used poll taxes, literacy tests, and violent intimidation. And until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, very hard fought by the civil rights movement, and with additional voting reforms in the 1970s on the federal level, finally this actually granted suffrage to people of color, which had been under the control of the states, and with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, shifted that responsibility to a federal mandate for voting. Some of the leaders who were a part of this movement, Angelina Grimke-Weld was an abolitionist and a suffragist. She said, "I want to be identified with the Negro. Until he gets his rights, we shall never get ours." So she's really bringing together the abolitionist fight and the suffragist fight and seeing them as intertwined. More recently, in 1964, Fannie Lou Hamer was one of the leaders of Freedom Summer, a campaign to register African Americans in the state of Mississippi to vote. She helped to also found the National Women's Political Caucus, among other activism. So both of these activists and many more, I could speak for hours about the civil rights movement, of course, were on the heels of the suffragists and really continued to fight for civil rights, for voting rights through the 1960s. And of course, we're seeing a new version of the civil rights movement, the contemporary civil rights movement today, which I'll speak about at the end of the talk. So what other activism was made possible because of that passage of the 19th Amendment? Well, this empowered women in environmental movements. In the 1920s, mostly white women led the General Federation of Women's Clubs. They used their new kind of confidence and power, having gained the right to vote. They sought to do lobbying. They lobbied for parks, for waterways. Here you see a picture of the Native American cliff dwellings in Mesa Verde National Park. And this was one of the achievements of the General Federation of Women's Clubs. They fought for this to become a national park and to preserve the cliff dwellings. Also, even before suffrage and then afterwards, middle-class Black women were at the helm of fighting for urban environmental issues. So Black women in Atlanta formed the Atlanta Neighborhood Union, and they fought for sanitation and public health in urban environments. In 1962, Rachel Carson kind of took the environmental movement to another level with her book, Silent Spring, where she opposed pesticides, chemicals in the air, water, and food, and this created a shift in the environmental movement. In the 1970s, in part due to Carson, who became a kind of informal leader of the environmental movement, women began to assume more leadership of environmental groups after having been denied, really, leadership in these groups in anything but volunteer positions. The Sierra Club, unfortunately, was one of those old boys clubs where it was very much led by men. But that started to change. So just to highlight some of these women leaders from the environmental movement, I want to call out the work of Winona LaDuke, a Native American woman leader, founder of the White Earth Land Recovery Project in Minnesota, seeking to return the reservation, the White Earth land, to the Native American populations and fight for the preservation of those lands. And she's also been very important in the fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline. Hazel Johnson founded People for Community Recovery in 1979. This focused on fighting environmental racism in Chicago, the removal of asbestos and toxic landfills. Some call Hazel the mother of the environmental justice movement. And Lois Gibbs, a a self-proclaimed housewife and mother in New York discovered that her neighborhood sat on top of 21,000 tons of buried chemical waste, which is now the infamous Love Canal. And Lois formed an environmental organization and fought, I believe it was Dow Chemical Company, got to check that, and got reforms and some reforms for the people of her community and help with moving, and saved many lives by calling out these terrible Superfund site on which their community was built. So environmental movements really opened up, and women have become so active and so vibrant within them, in part because of the activism of the 1920s. However, I want us also to recognize that not all women who became politically active and inspired by the 19th Amendment did so for progressive causes or feminism. The 1920 19th Amendment actually provided a political opening for women in the hate movement as well. The 1920s Klan sought to win political offices and also collect dues from their members. They wanted to grow their organization. And the 19th Amendment brought a whole new group of voters who were possible in the Klan's efforts. So they sought to recruit women to these hate movements. Still, they wanted women to be separate and subordinate. They developed the Women's KKK. It collapsed in the late 1920s, but throughout the 1920s, there were many vibrant organizations where women were promoting a message of hate and racism, and with that kind of new power that they'd gained as enfranchised voters. In World War II, women's hate movements also had a kind of flourishing anti-Semitic movements and pro-fascist movements. And in the 1960s and 1970s, women opposed racial desegregation. They opposed the civil rights movement. So, you know, we need to recognize this history in the United States and the history of women's activism as not always for progressive causes, and the 19th Amendment allowing not only movements and activism on the left, but also on the right, something we need to continue to be careful of. Today, some clans allow women to assume leadership roles and participate in meetings and organizations. These are mixed gender and something we should look out for more. They've been on the rise over the last 10 to 12 years. The third part of my talk today is about contemporary feminism. So I'm going to close by talking about two additional movements that I think have some resonance with the suffragists, hark back to, you know, they wouldn't be where they are today without the activism of women 100 years ago. Let me say it that way. Just gonna check the time really quickly, excuse me. Okay, great, we're doing good. So a lot of the information that I'll share with you from this section is from the book, Nevertheless They Persisted. Of course, a modification of Nevertheless She Persisted, which has been which is about Elizabeth Warren and her persistence in the face of, I think it was Mitch McConnell, and her forthrightness. But this book traces feminisms and the continued resistance in the US women's movement, and kind of talks about that diversity, the range of goals. So there are chapters about online feminism, trans feminist and LGBTQ activism, anti-trafficking and feminism, ecofeminism and climate justice, and activism against sexual assault on campus. And these are just some of the concerns of contemporary feminists. I think suffragists from 100 years ago would look at this list and just be wowed that women's activism has expanded and broadened and is so concerned with all of these issues. In fact, the persistence of women's activism is in large part because it has diversified so much, because women have taken up a broad range of goals and tactics, and they've been active in mixed gender moments of activism. So the first I'll share with you about is my analysis of the Occupy Wall Street movement. It's my book here is the first feminist and intersectional analysis of this movement. The movement emerged in 2011 in New York. More than 1,000 encampments formed soon after in the US and globally, largely spread. The word was spread over social media and people in their local spaces took it up. And we are the 99% versus the 1% most wealthy government, corporations, and banks really became the driving collective idea of the movement, the we are the 99%. But as you can tell from the title of my book, I think that there are some issues with this, that feminists did not feel like everyone was included in that 99%. And this is in part because there was a great debate within the movement. So on one side of the debate of women's participation, some people said this movement was dominated by white men, sexism was rampant but ignored in the encampments and movement organizations, and feminism was peripheral to the movement. So a little bit shocking to hear this side of the story. I think our suffragists from 100 years ago probably thought we would be further along than this. However, my research revealed many kinds of gender conflict. Ellie, who formed part of the Women's Caucus, says, "I never felt as marginalized and unsafe as my first night at OWS. There were men everywhere. Men outnumbered women sleeping in the park 3-1. I also found that women were marginalized in the media. 10 people were interviewed on the morning news. One of them was a woman. The 99% is not 90% men. So some real trouble with women's representation and participation in the Occupy movement. And also, perhaps one of the most troubling, the Hot Chicks of Occupy Wall Street website. So 244 likes for this woman. Would our suffragists have thought that 100 years later, there could be something quite as objectifying of women as something like the Hot Chicks of Occupy Wall Street? Of course, there was a lot of debate. Well, this brought in heterosexual men into the movement, and these women were beautiful, but they weren't depicted as full-fledged activists. On the other side of the debate, however, some took the position that women participated in all aspects of the movement's work, that feminist organizations contributed significantly, and I did find a lot of evidence to this fact as well. So 1960s and 1970s feminists and contemporary feminists contributed to Occupy. For me, this is one of the most exciting things about today's activism, is that there's so many generations of activists who are working together. Pictured here is Angela Davis speaking in Oakland for Occupy. And the movement formed a variety of groups, new groups, to promote women's participation. WOWs, Oakland Occupy Patriarchy, womenoccupy.org. And you see here some of the younger, maybe anarchist feminists participating in the movement. I also found an important formation of feminist collective identity from within Occupy. Groups used that gender conflict kind of to their advantage. So Imogene told me in an interview, names are changed for confidentiality. We got broadsided with reports of people saying, I feel really intimidated, I was harassed, I was hit upon, whatever, all of these reports. And we put up the Facebook page really quickly and people started migrating there and sharing stories. I think that forged a number of opportunities for people to work together. So feminists really coming together and having so much experience already to draw on about how to identify sexism. And they acted very quickly, much more quickly, I think, than feminists in, let's say, the 1970s did. Feminists also formed their own separate spaces. Here, under construction, Women's Safe Space, creating a tent only for women and queer folks and femmes to be able to sleep safely in the encampments at night. I also identified the phenomenon of bridge leaders forming within the Occupy movement. So drawing on Belinda Robnett's analysis of women's participation in the civil rights movement, bridge leaders being those connectors, grassroots leaders, women who were doing the hard work of organizing on the ground. They were a real force within the Occupy movement. I'm gonna skip the quote for now. Women's and feminist cultures were also key to the outpouring that became Occupy Wall Street. And I love this poster by Alexandra Fisher, kind of fusing together, right? Rosie the Riveter, the Occupy tattoo, the Guy Fawkes mask, kind of queering that mask by having Rosie wearing this masculine mask. This poster speaks to so many things that are a part of contemporary feminism today. So what I sum up from this debate, on the one side, women really kind of nowhere, and on the other side, women everywhere. I really value the analysis of Jo Rieger in her book about contemporary feminism in the United States. And she says, this is contemporary feminism today. It's not really a debate. All the scholars and journalists on either side were right. Both of these things are happening. Women are marginalized, and at the same time, women are leaders and women are doing incredible kinds of activism within this movement. The last part of my talk about contemporary feminism highlights the women and feminists in the Black Lives Matter movement. In 2013, 3 queer women, radical Black organizers, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, created a Black-centered political will and movement building project called Black Lives Matter. I think at least parts of the suffragists movement, of course there were racial divisions, but several of the suffragists would be just wowed to see the activism for Black Lives Matter and that this movement has been led and created by so many women leaders. Alicia Garza talks about bringing together her feminist values and objectives to the Black Lives Matter movement. She says, we're not here just fighting for Black men. We acknowledge for us to get free as Black people, we can't leave anybody behind. And that has to be the innovation in terms of this generation's movement. We have to learn from movements prior to us that, quite frankly, could not be sustained because of the question of the disenfranchisement of women, because of the question of patriarchy. I think we can hear that resonance with suffragists and abolitionists 100 years ago in her statement. In an article that Alicia also wrote, her story though, she talks about some of the challenges and debates within the Black Lives Matter movement. She talks about the All Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter, or you name it, what kind of lives matter, and the ways that these slogans and statements actually detract from the statement of Black Lives Matter and how there's a specific focus that we need to have on Black Lives Matter, that if we're going to be in solidarity with this movement and to actually transform civil rights and take it to the next level, we really need to be specific about Black Lives Matter. Another debate within the movement that feminists are tackling is highlighted by Professor Brittany Cooper. She is one of the founders of the Crunk Feminist Collective, which is a space of support and camaraderie for hip hop generation feminists of color, queer and straight in the academy and without. And she highlights another debate that's kind of the forefront of one of the feminist debates within the Black Lives Matter movement. She says, at a party for Black Lives Matter at a conference, a man of trans experience was removed from a men's bathroom by club security. And the act catalyzed a series of conversations throughout the weekend about the deep and necessary work of challenging our own transphobia, creating a space that's trans inclusive. And there were some suggestions such as creating gender neutral bathrooms, or a proposal that I love, instead of referring to each other as only brothers and sisters, how about as siblings or sibs, a gender neutral term that retains that loving kinship that we attempt to signal using brother or sister, but we're not trafficking in those gender binaries anymore. It's a much more inclusive term. So even within the Black Lives Matter movement, while there's been a lot of feminist activism and women leaders, there are still some areas where feminists are working on, and there's many more issues that they're addressing. Some of the women-specific activism within the Black Lives Matter movement, you may remember Ashley Williams, a queer Black woman organizer. This phrase was excerpted from a speech that Clinton gave in 1996 that supported expanding the prison system. And this viral image and video of Ashley captured a sentiment among Black Lives Matter activists who questioned Clinton's support for racial justice. Women and feminists' media activism in Black Lives Matter has garnered a lot of support for Black Lives Matter for women's activism. And I highlight this experience because, contrary to the women of the 1950s through 70s civil rights movement, women have really taken center stage in the contemporary civil rights movement, such as Ashley. Also taking center stage, Kimberly Crenshaw, professor and activist at UCLA Law School and also Columbia Law School, created probably the most well-known and widespread women's activism within Black Lives Matter called #SayHerName. It was launched in December 2014 by the African American Policy Forum and Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies, of which Crenshaw is the leader. And this Say Her Name campaign has brought awareness to the often invisible names and stories of Black women and girls who have been victimized by racist police violence, and it provides support to their families. I'll come back to this. I want to provide some time for Q&A, so I'm going to skip over this, but if you want to learn more about Say Her Name, I will come back to this. Say Her Name, while mainly the killings of Black men sparked Black Lives Matter, the Say Her Name media guide has pushed back on that myth that Black women are not also at risk. And here you see them taking the guide into the streets with these giant posters to say her name, Miriam Carey, Michelle Kusea, Rikia Boyd, Kayla Moore, and there are so many more. And I want to end this section by saying her name, Breonna Taylor, who we are still fighting for justice for today. And I hope that you will join that fight. My conclusion. I have argued that there has been a continuous flow of women's and feminist movements over the last 100 years, much inspired by and opened up by the abolitionists movements from Sojourner Truth, who even earlier than the 19th Amendment we're celebrating today in 1851, was contributing to the abolitionist movement and also to the suffragist movement. And then we have, right, in recent times, 2016, this iconic photo of Aisha Evans standing up to the Baton Rouge police as part of the Black Lives Matter protest. Our movements have continued. The fight for equality includes voting and beyond. I've made this argument throughout our talk today. Some fronts we need to continue to fight for voting rights. Only in 2015, where women in Saudi Arabia provided the right to vote and voted for the first time. And of course, many, especially women of color, continue to be disenfranchised. But women's activism has gone so far beyond. Women were holding down the camp at Standing Rock to advocate climate justice and protest the Dakota Access Pipeline. I love this colorful picture of so many women fighting for our Mother Earth. And the third point that I've made today is that contemporary feminist activism is diverse in its goals, tactics, strategies, locations, and feminist activism is incredibly relevant to our contemporary struggles. We've come a long way from Lila Roop's analysis of women in the 1910s, the suffragists in the US and the UK, and some of their fight for peace in World War I. We've come a long way since then to all of the examples I've shared, and Malala Yousafzai, my personal hero, a warrior for women and girls' education around the world. There's so much that we can support today, so many diverse tactics, strategies, and globally. I've shared with you a brief story, the tip of the iceberg, from the suffragists and the celebration that we're having today over 100 years to Occupy, Black Lives Matter, and beyond, a fascinating and long-running sisterhood. Thank you so much for being here. I welcome your discussion. If you have stories to share about your own activism, about the suffragists, or if you have questions for me, I am happy to stay on and dialogue for a while. Thank you.
Thank you. That was tremendous. Sort of, it's so daunting to think about, this being 100 anniversaries, and then you just see how much we've done and yet how much there's still to do. It's a great call to action for everything, especially now in these months before the elections and everything. That was great. So there are a lot of questions and comments. I'll do all of them later on. I'll sort of just read through the questions here. One of the things I'm loving about this too is I say this a lot, but this lecture especially, it's so sad that we're not all there together in a room, but we have people from Pennsylvania and Charleston and Indiana, Pennsylvania, and all over the place. So it's just great that we can, we can all be together across state lines too.
Fantastic.
So I'll just read you some of the questions. And so in areas where women of color were able to vote post 1920, I apologize, did they vote in greater or lesser numbers when compared with white women?
Ooh, that's a wonderful question. I don't have the details on that question, but what I do know is voter suppression was so widespread. My hunch is that women of color were not able to go to the polls as easily as white women. Of course, men of color were also not able to vote at this time. And so I find it highly unlikely that women of color were voting in greater numbers than white women until 1965.
Mm-hmm. And why did the League of Women Voters and others oppose the ERA?
Great question. I'm also going to check in with the League of Women Voters people in our group today to see what you have to say. And from what I know about the split in the movement, I'm going to characterize it as somewhat contentious, but that there was a lot of work to be done. There was work to be done for continuing specifically women's organizing and women's rights, and the women's, the faction led by Alice Paul was kind of taking that up. But at the same time, voter education, working on welfare issues, kind of mobilizing the women and men that the League of Women Voters could, was also needed. There was just so much to be done that there was that split, and there was that kind of two different streams that came out of the suffragists movement. I'm not an expert on that time period, but maybe those who are part of the League of Women Voters might share a little bit more about that.
Okay. Another question. You seem to indicate that women of color did not get the vote until the Voting Rights Act. Where were they able to vote?
So it's my understanding that the 19th Amendment, so let me even back up. I believe it was the 15th Amendment that granted citizenship to people of all racial groups. And so, or that might have been the 14th, and the 15th was granting voting rights. I might have them flip-flopped, but essentially, this opened the door for even men of color to technically, legally be allowed to vote. However, in the 19th Amendment then, technically opened the door for women of all races to be able to vote. However, until 1965, states were in control of who voted, how, where, and they implemented these poll taxes and did not support, in general, the right to vote for women of color and people of color of any gender. And so it was only until that federal legislation that we saw broad voting from women or men of any race or ethnic background. I wish I had more specifics about it. I will turn you toward Celeste Montoya's analysis in the 100 Years of Women's Activism book that I mentioned. It's a fascinating chapter and really goes through the various, really an intersectional analysis. So not only the gender analysis of voting, but the racial analysis of voting and where those intersected. I recommend her work, Celeste Montoya, in the 100 Years of Women's Activism book for more on that.
And so maybe this is sort of along those same lines, and they should look there too. But Denise asked that she'd love to hear more about when, where, and how women of color started to vote. And related to that, can you speak to the issues of exclusion within feminism?
That's a great question, thank you. So this is in part going to answer your question, I hope. I want to signal the civil rights movement as a movement that women of color, the movement in the 1950s through the 1960s, this really opened up, especially Black and Chicana women's, and even Asian American persons and people of various other races and ethnicities. Of course, the civil rights movement was not only for Black persons, it was civil rights for everyone. And this really inspired the Chicana civil rights movement and people of color to participate in solidarity, whatever their locations. So I think we really saw an opening of women's political participation in the civil rights movement. And I'll go back to the Freedom Summer. The Freedom Summer in 1964 was a watershed moment in women and men registering to vote. This was an act of civil disobedience at the time to even register. And young people, especially from the North, took buses down to the South. They assisted, Black and white young people assisted in registering people to vote at this time in large numbers. This was met with great violence. There was great media coverage. And this was really an opening, this Freedom Summer, for the beginnings of a much larger enfranchisement of women and men, and which eventually led to the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. As far as the second part of the question, the continuing racial divisions within contemporary feminist activism, I mean, since the abolitionists and suffragists, there have been divides about the focus for women's activism. This continued with the separate roads to feminism and has continued into contemporary activism. So some of those examples include, perhaps you remember in 2015, the slut walks. Women went into the streets, they were wearing risque clothing, they were demanding to be respected and their sexuality to be embraced no matter what they were wearing, to be respected as people. And women of color, especially Black women, said, you know, we're not gonna reclaim this idea of being sluts. This is something opposing our fight for freedom, our fight for liberation right now. Sluts means something completely different for us because we have been objectified, abused, been the Jezebels of the world for so long. We're not going to reclaim this. And that is one moment of a great divide. Another moment that comes to my mind, the 2017 Women's March. A lot of debate within this, major outpouring of activism, but how much was it led by women of color? Do the pussy hats fully represent the diversity of feminist movements, or do they represent white women's anatomy? What about men? What about trans persons? What about women of color who have a variety of colors of their anatomy? Was this represented in the pussy hats? A lot of critique and debate and a lot of pushing for greater intersectional analysis within contemporary feminism. I think this keeps coming up. I actually think it's good. I think that these racist, white supremacy within feminist movements and organizing is being revealed, it's being brought into the light. The lack of intersectionality in contemporary feminism is brought into the light, and it's there that we can deal with it. It's there that we can hopefully make it go away. And actually in my book, Are We the 99%, I pose many of these contrasts, ways that activists were organizing intersectionally and ways that they weren't, ways that they were coming up short. And the book provides lessons for contemporary intersectional organizing.
So did your research indicate differences in female participation levels in activism movements, such as gun control, healthcare, equity, education, civil rights, voting rights? Are the female versus male participation levels significantly different?
Fantastic question. That sounds like another edited volume to me. That could be at least a 100-page book of many different chapters. Unfortunately, I don't have an incredibly specific answer to that question. My hunch would be that there is variation in the levels of participation. What I can say for sure is that my research helps us to ask the question, and since my work, one of the earliest places that I studied and participated in women's movements was with women in the Philippines. I did a master's degree in women and development studies, and really where I got my orientation to thinking about grassroots women of color and how they organize and the expertise that they have. And they taught me well. They said, ask the question, what about the women? So sometimes you might not see women activists on the news. You might not see them, their quotations featured in an article. You might not get a viral video about women. But in each of these movements that you've mentioned, I would ask the question, what about the women? What kind of specific women's organizing is going on? Because I will bet you at least $1 for every year since the passage of the 19th Amendment that women are kind of doing their own thing. They're developing their own tactics and strategies unique to being women, such as we saw like in the Black Lives Matter movement with SayHerName, uniquely calling out the experiences of women in each of these movements.
Okay. Here's another great question. Is there a moment, it's sort of along those lines too, is there a moment, Laura asks, is there a moment in history or a specific event that you have had to relearn, most recently like with Black Lives Matter, et cetera, regarding Black, Indigenous people of color and how history is whitewashing? And if so, what was it and why?
This is a great question also. So, I mean, personally, as an activist myself, I feel that I'm continually learning. One of the most important books that I've read recently is Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And he challenges us to examine really everything that we do. Are we promoting anti-racism, or are we replicating a racist history that we don't actually want to be? Most recently, I've kind of re-examined this in some of the readings for my classes at Case Western. I've decided to drop some readings. I've decided to add some additional readings and videos. I mean, I teach about Black Lives Matter. I teach about the experiences of Black and Latino boys. I do teach already about a lot of the experiences and an intersectional analysis of gender and racial inequality in my classes, but the book prompted me to really take a step back and rethink about it. I will just say that my first experience that popped into, so that's kind of my most recent work that I'm working on currently, because I see my classes at Case Western as an opportunity for students to talk about this moment, and even, you know, for us to go further in ending racism in my class. I think that's possible. But I was challenged by women in the Philippines who, I was there during September 11th, actually, and they posed it to me. They said, you know, which side are you on? You know, are you in the van with us who are gonna fight for peace? Or are you on the other side? You've got to make a choice. And I chose peace and recognizing the colonial history of the Philippines as one that I did not want to support anymore, with US intervention there. And they challenged me. They said, okay, we've taught you, we think you're on the right side of things, go back to the United States and make some change. So that's what I'm still doing.
Nice. How about equality in the workplace, like glass ceiling issues, especially since this gives women financial independence and power?
Great question. And a gap in my talk. Thank you for bringing that up. I really didn't touch that much on women's participation in the workplace. I would say this is another case of nowhere, everywhere. Women have made so many inroads into the workplace. A great works to check out would be Paula England, who writes about the unfinished gender revolution. Also, Kathleen Gerson has a great book about how far women have come and how far our families have come. So in a lot of ways, women have moved into the labor force. Women are participating in the legal field, in biology, in a range of other professions that were once male dominated. But there are some fields that are still quite male dominated. Technology fields, computer science, some other medical fields. And something to keep in mind, how much have men taken up work in female dominated fields? This is a real divide. So I just recently looked at these statistics. At Case Western, 80% of nursing students are women. Only 20% are men. Why does that persist in that way? Similarly, in the applied social sciences, it's very lopsided. Women are the majority of social workers and men are really not taking up this field. So I see it, as Paula England and Kathleen Gerson do, as still uneven. A gender revolution that we need to continue to fight. And we've made a lot of changes, but I think that there are quite a few that we still need to work on in the workplace.
Yeah. What about Gloria Steinem, who started the women's liberation movement, created the feminist publication Ms. Magazine?
Fantastic. Thank you so much for bringing Gloria Steinem into the conversation. We should do, a cheers to her. She was a great feminist leader, like many of those I've mentioned in this talk today. I think definitely she's inspired a lot of other feminists. That's my take on Gloria Steinem. She's been an important woman leader, an important media activist. I will also say because I did research on this, as far as during the Clinton and Bernie Sanders fight, we had Gloria Steinem making the sexist statement of, why are the women with Bernie? Oh, they're with the boys. Maybe you remember this from her appearance on Bill Maher. So I think she took back that statement, and I think she really was hoping to interest young feminists in Clinton's campaign, but it kind of had the opposite effect. And contemporary feminists who are for Bernie took it up with the hashtag "not here for boys." And so they really were advocating their place in Bernie Sanders' mobilizations and their right to be there as women, as full-fledged activists. In the end, I think Gloria Steinem is a great, feminist leader. She's amazing that she's still going in her 80s, and I hope she continues a lot longer. But I think as you've seen from the whole of my talk, I'm a critical feminist in this moment. We have to take stock here. We have to kind of be on our A game and be critical of ourselves and others, and we want to try to be better people.
Mm-hmm. Do you have time for just a couple more?
Sure.
Okay. You mentioned the abeyance that pervaded the 1940s and 50s in the US. However, American women achieved a great deal of sovereignty during World War II. Post-war, why do you think they resumed their earlier positions rather than asserted their new autonomy and attempted to hold on to the powerful stations they occupied during the war and or expand upon them?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing in that history and bringing into our conversation women who became welders, women who worked on the ships, women who became machinists, took up every job that men who left to fight in the war left, and they really kept the war effort going. There's a wonderful historic film I recommend. I think it's called Rosie the Riveter or the Rosies, something to that effect. And it traces how much these women loved their jobs and embraced them, and they became excellent at their trades. As a sociologist, I'm going to argue that the social, political, structural forces really ended women having those jobs and positions. So businesses and government officials basically made a blanket statement and just fired women right out from these jobs. You know, men were returning from war, men need places to work, and especially if you were married, you could no longer work in these industries. So women were really forced to leave their positions. And so I think there was a lot of kind of top-down pushing women out, and women did not have their own separate factories to go into and work on. And some of the fight for women to be included in things like unions or in trade schools, to even take up professional plumbing certificates and be allowed to develop those trades and have the licenses for those trades, really only started in the 1970s. That was part of that struggle to officially allow women's participation in unions and trades. I will also say another force going on. I believe this swayed women who had been working in the paid labor force during World War II. Was the rhetoric after World War II was return to the home, become a homemaker, take care of your family, take care of your man. This was that doldrums period. And those media messages were strong. They really were. They caused even a lot of depression and anxiety among women, because they knew these messages are not signaling all of who I am. I'm more than just able to cook and take care of children, but it took Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique for women to recognize these sexist media messages and start to talk to each other, form consciousness raising circles, form groups with other housewives and say, you know what, we're really discontent about this, about this personal parts of our lives. We're gonna make the personal political, and we're gonna fight against these messages. And through that, we had so many openings that happened in the 1960s and 1970s.
Okay, and then there was one more I wanted to go back to. Sorry, there are so many comments.
Fantastic. I
yes.
hope I can read them after.
Yes, they'll be sent to me and I will send them to you. Why can't Um, sorry, everybody. Where are you? Okay. Did Margaret Sanger, what about Margaret Sanger and the introduction of birth control pills? Did she consider herself as a feminist and or an activist? What was her, and I think that's probably where we'll end up.
Great question. Again, bringing a leader in women's reproductive rights into our discussion, though a controversial leader, of course, as she has been known for her racist views and not her views on limiting women of color's reproductive rights really was a part of her activism. So, you know, I think it's kind of this debate that feminism is a protest. It's a constant protest of re-examining even our most intimate and personal lives, such as reproduction and the becoming of mothers. And in many ways, Margaret Sanger and developing Planned Parenthood was a breakthrough for women. The birth control pill radically has transformed women, and we still need to fight for widespread contraception and for Planned Parenthood, which does so much more than even just contraception. But I think we have to recognize that history of Margaret Sanger as really using or allowing or seeing a possibility for birth control and sterilization to be hindering women of color. And of course, I don't support that part of her activism. Kind of very critical, complicated beginning of Planned Parenthood. I think where they are today, they are necessary, such a necessary women's organization in our country. But again, there's that controversy. So I think you've kind of raised a little challenge for us, and I hope it dovetails with the challenge that I've posed to you throughout this talk to examine more closely, what about the women? Where are the women? And in what ways are women promoting intersectional feminism? Or in what ways are they kind of falling short? And we need to keep transforming and fighting.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, thank you so much. That was great and such a perfect lecture to have on this anniversary of such an amazing moment, and again reminding us of everything else that still needs to be done. And along those lines too, I just want to announce it's official today that our next one of these lectures, women empowerment lectures with the League of Women Voters and Case Western's Lifelong Learning and Cleveland History Center is going to be on Wednesday, September 23rd with Joy Bostick, who's the Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Africana Studies and the founding director for the African and African American Studies program here at Case Western Reserve University. And her talk is entitled The Long Arc of Justice and the Beloved Community, Courage and Resilience in Black Women's Struggles for Universal Voting Rights and Political Power. And so I hope you guys will all look out for that on Case Western's Lifelong Learning website and the League of Women Voters website. And again, thank you so much, Heather, for speaking to us tonight. This was great.
You're welcome. It's been
thank you, Mike, and oh, sorry. and Mike and League of Women Voters and Cleveland History Center. Sorry, I didn't mean to step on you.
That's okay.
All right. Good night. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.